Hi. I'm David Durston. I guess I'll just leave that where it is. Alumni architecture class of 91, and I actually never left. I've been teaching here ever since. I'm a professor in the School of Architecture, and I proudly was the associate dean with John Haydock and the acting dean after he passed. And I have to say, you know, this has been a wild, shocking kind of experience. And it's incredibly complex and nuanced. And when I engage something like that, my response generally is to write, because words help me, and moving them around helps me think about things. So I've actually put some words down. It's only about 4 or 5 minutes, but if you allow me, I'd like to share them with you. So yeah, it's clear that today our Cooper Union faces a grave crisis, certainly the most serious in my lifetime and perhaps in the institutions. The speed and intensity of the response of this community is magnificent, and it speaks to the structural nature of this crisis. At the core, the question facing us is, what holds up the Cooper Union? This is no easy question, but I believe we gain insight to it by looking to the foundation of the institution, free speech. The foundation building is literally held up by free speech. The seeds of this foundation were planted by Peter Cooper and Abraham Lincoln. And from these seeds grew a magnificent principle, the founding principle of this school, free education. It is not that the Cooper Union holds up free education. Free education holds up the Cooper Union. We are now confronted with a crisis that threatens to collapse this structural principle. As we struggle to address this crisis, to comprehend it, navigate it, act within it, I propose that everything we need has been said in this great hall over the last 150 years. From Lincoln's Right Makes Might to Frederick Douglass and Red Cloud to the founding of the Red Cross and the NAACP. This space contains monumental moments. Each grew out of the urgent demands of a given period, threatening fundamental principles of human rights. In each case, the crisis caused by these threats led to a clarification of the very principles at risk. Each of these moments galvanized the meaning of the principles themselves, and in fact led to movements that revolutionized the historic trajectory. I believe the crisis we face today contains just such a potential. We must resist the confusion that the crisis we face is so grave that it demands abandoning our principles in order to survive. We must reject the notion that the urgent eclipses the essential. The very meaning of guiding principles is found in their capacity to navigate uncertainty. History is littered with disasters born in the missteps of suspending principles in the face of crisis. The hard work of navigating this moment will not be found in weak arguments about Peter Cooper having mixed intentions, about early fee structures, and free education for the working classes only. Even if this were true, even if it took 42 years until the Cooper Union offered free tuition to all, this is no justification to go backwards. The vision and guiding principle was clear from the beginning. And as we all know, as this room knows, it took 87 years between all men are created equal and the Emancipation Proclamation. Our founders' missteps are no justification for us to repeat them. Peter, practical way. The principle of inclusion, of no barriers to education, not only righted a wrong, but it created one of the most intellectually and creatively vital places in the world. And this is no accident of history. Peter Cooper understood that the barriers to education not only were unjust to those that they excluded, but those barriers impoverish the internal life of an institution. Any segment of the population creates a diminished human geography within the educational community. In creating the Cooper Union, Peter Cooper invested in the profound idea that removing the barriers to education creates a dynamic crucible of free thought, a space where the widest spectrum of who we are can ask the questions of our time and create the works that bring us forward. This principle of removing barriers of free education constitutes the most precise, and therefore pragmatic, means of addressing the extraordinary complex questions of any given time. The evidence of a return on this investment is abundant. No one can deny that it has been returned 1,000-fold through the significant contributions of this community across all human endeavor. As with many forms of structural invention, the consequences of Peter Cooper's invention is the structures of education. In the structures of education are unique spaces, inclusive spaces, spaces of participation, of reciprocity, for people in their works to listen to each other. We can afford no red line within these spaces dividing the freely educated and the educated for a price. Creating any financial barriers for even a few students weakens the structural principles of free speech, free thought, and free education that hold up this institution. Like each of the movements galvanized in this room, the internal crisis we face is a symptom of the broader crisis of our time. The gross inequities in resource distribution that characterize our moment threaten to absorb this shining community into the markets. The broader dysfunctions of decisions made by the few with disastrous consequences for the many are directly implicated in our internal crisis. The hard work of navigating this moment, of clarifying the meaning of our principles, will not be found in the neutrality of looking forward only. The questions of accountability, of broken bonds of trust, of hubristic excesses writ large, figure strongly within our current crisis. We must not shy away from these facts. Any solution requires an honest, hard look at the decisions made that led to this crisis. When the foundations are free speech, there is no room for sweeping things under the rug. Navigating this moment requires looking at and absorbing the lessons of the past, but it also requires present tense creativity. When confronted with intractable problems, it is rarely the rush to solutions that solve the problems, but more the search for the questions. The work of digging deep into the structure of the problem and articulating its root questions. We have the opportunity to clarify and galvanize free education as a fundamental right to all people, to clarify our social contract and push forward a movement that recognizes the transformative powers of education as a human right. Did anything, surely it was to plant the seeds of this movement. And now we have the opportunity to bring it to fruition. There are times when communities achieve a certain momentum, the spirit of a place captures the transformative spirit of a given period. When these alignments occur, profound shifts are possible. And I believe we are in just such a moment. The challenges and possibilities of this moment are, of course, extraordinary. And they call for creative urgency and thoughtful, considered stewardship. For the stakes for what happens here are enormous. How we comprehend and act in this moment reaches far beyond this institution. The Cooper Union currently faces an internal crisis that warrants the Cooper Union's Great Hall as the location of its founding movement. And as we all know, right makes money.